It started with a sentence that sounded like bravado but turned into a warning for the world. "We don't need Canada's lumber." When Donald Trump said those words, it wasn't just political theater, it was the start of an economic earthquake that would shake two nations to their core. Within weeks, the United States slapped heavy tariffs on Canadian lumber, claiming it was about national security. But behind the tough talk, there was no plan, only pride. At first, Washington celebrated. They said American mills would rise again, that home builders would rely on local wood, and that the country would finally stand on its own. But the reality hit fast. Prices skyrocketed. Home construction stalled. Contractors began pulling out of projects mid-build. And ordinary Americans, the families who dreamed of owning a home, suddenly couldn't afford one. The ripple effect was brutal. Within months, the cost of lumber crossed $650 per thousand board feet, adding thousands to every new home. Builders panicked. Markets convulsed. And what began as a political stunt became a full-blown housing crisis. North of the border, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't retaliate. He didn't shout or threaten. Instead, he adapted. Canada launched new funds, new partnerships, and new markets, turning Trump's tariffs into a turning point for independence. This wasn't just a trade war, it was an identity shift. The United States, once the builder of the global economy, was now struggling to build its own homes. And Canada, the quiet neighbor, was turning into a global supplier of strength, stability, and strategy. When Donald Trump stood before cameras and announced massive tariffs on Canadian lumber, his words carried the swagger of a man certain of victory. "We have more lumber than they do," he boasted. "We don't need Canada." In that moment, what sounded like confidence was actually the start of an economic storm that no one in Washington had prepared for. The decision hit like a thunderclap. Overnight, Canadian lumber, the backbone of America's homebuilding industry, became drastically more expensive. Within days, lumber prices shot up to $650 per thousand board feet, a surge that sent shockwaves through the construction sector. Homebuilders across the country began freezing projects, and what was supposed to be a patriotic boost for domestic industry quickly turned into a national headache. In states like Texas, Arizona, and Florida, thousands of construction workers were told to stand down. Developers couldn't afford the inflated prices. Smaller companies folded under the pressure. Lumber yards went quiet. The very policy meant to protect American jobs ended up putting them at risk. The ripple effects didn't stop there. Hardware stores, supply chains, and even mortgage brokers began feeling the strain. As prices climbed, housing affordability plunged. Families who had saved for years to build a home suddenly found themselves priced out of the market entirely. Economists warned that Trump's America First tariffs were creating an inflationary bomb, one that would take years to defuse. And they were right. Because by declaring independence from Canada, the U.S. had declared war on its own housing stability. The market that once defined the American dream was collapsing under its own flag. The shockwave had only begun, and what followed next would expose just how deeply dependent the U.S. had always been on the ally it had just insulted. Behind the political fireworks and patriotic speeches, the numbers painted a grim, undeniable truth. Canada wasn't some minor player in America's lumber market, it was the backbone. Every year, roughly 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber crossed the border into the United States, making up a full quarter of America's total supply. In other words, 1 out of every 4 homes built in the U.S. depended on Canadian timber. By cutting off that flow overnight, Trump's administration had gambled with math it didn't understand. Even if every U.S. sawmill ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they'd still fall short by more than 3 billion board feet. And that's in a perfect world, one with no labor shortages, no aging equipment, and unlimited forest resources. Reality was far messier. American mills were already running at 95% capacity, struggling with outdated machinery and a shrinking workforce. Years of underinvestment had hollowed out the domestic industry, leaving it unable to absorb the shock. Experts had warned this for decades, saying it would take 10 years or more of massive investment to replace Canada's role. But Washington ignored them. As prices soared, construction companies began hemorrhaging money. Each week of delay meant millions lost. Contractors couldn't meet deadlines. Housing demand outpaced supply. And with inflation already climbing, the lumber crisis became the final straw. For the average American family, the effects were brutal. The price of a new home jumped by thousands within months. Wages didn't rise, costs did. What was once a political stunt to bring jobs back had turned into a cruel equation where pride equaled pain. The math didn't care about slogans. It revealed the truth Washington refused to face. The U.S. couldn't build without Canada, and the price of denial was only getting higher. While Washington fumed and the U.S. housing market spiraled, Ottawa's response was something no one expected: calm, calculated, and quietly revolutionary. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't go on television shouting threats or trading insults. Instead, he went to work. His government rolled out a $500 million diversification fund to help Canadian lumber companies find new buyers outside the U.S. border. A few weeks later came an even larger $1.2 billion resilience package, designed to protect producers from anti-dumping penalties and to spark innovation within the sector itself. Carney's message was simple but sharp. This isn't retaliation, it's reinvention. Behind those words was a masterclass in strategy. While the U.S. tried to wall itself off, Canada was opening doors. Provinces like British Columbia and Alberta, long dependent on steady U.S. demand, began retooling their industries. Aging sawmills were modernized, and new investments poured into automation, renewable energy, and export infrastructure. In Carney's view, the lumber war wasn't a crisis, it was an awakening. For decades, Canada's forestry industry had been treated like a sidekick to America's economic story. Now it was stepping into its own spotlight. The government framed the moment not as economic pain but as opportunity, a chance to redefine what Canadian lumber meant on the world stage. And the tone worked. Investors saw stability where others saw chaos. New trade missions were launched, innovation grants approved, and port upgrades accelerated. While Washington's headlines screamed conflict, Canada's quiet confidence was already rewriting the rules of global trade. The world began to notice something different about this new Canada. It didn't panic under pressure, it adapted. And that calm, steady hand would soon turn a domestic industry into a global force. When Trump's tariffs slammed the door shut, Canada didn't waste time knocking, it found new doors to open. Within months, Canadian lumber that once flowed south began moving east and west, carried by cargo ships instead of freight trains. South Korea, Vietnam, India, Australia, and the United Kingdom became the new faces of demand. What started as desperation soon evolved into strategy. The real breakthrough came in Japan, where imports of Canadian lumber surged by nearly 26% in early 2024. Japanese builders known for their precision and quality standards saw something rare, a supplier that was both stable and sustainable. As American politics turned inward, Canada became the reliable partner everyone wanted. Then came a wave of new trade agreements. Deals with Germany and South Korea signaled that Canada was no longer looking to recover, it was expanding. Lumber was no longer just a raw export. It was a brand built on trust, transparency, and green innovation. Every plank shipped abroad carried a silent message. Canada doesn't beg for markets, it earns them. At home, the transformation was visible in every major port. Vancouver and Prince Rupert underwent billion-dollar modernizations to handle booming international demand. Automated cranes, digital logistics systems, and expanded shipping terminals turned these hubs into the beating heart of Canada's new trade empire. For the first time in modern history, Canada's lumber industry wasn't defined by its dependence on the U.S. Instead, it was carving out a global identity, one built on stability, ethics, and strategy. The U.S. had built walls. Canada was building bridges. And while Washington fought a self-made housing crisis, Ottawa quietly positioned itself as the world's most dependable supplier of growth. The world had shifted, and this time it wasn't moving around America. As Canada's ships sailed east, the United States was drowning in its own policies. By mid-year, the ripple effects of Trump's tariffs had turned into a tidal wave. Every 1% increase in lumber costs added roughly $1,000 to the price of a new home. When prices soared to $765 per thousand board feet, the result was devastating. An average of $10,000 added to the cost of every single-family house. And yet, wages hadn't moved an inch. In Texas, Ohio, and Florida, construction projects froze mid-build. Developers stared at half-finished frames, calculating losses they could no longer absorb. Builders began canceling contracts altogether, while buyers who had already secured loans found themselves priced out overnight. The National Association of Home Builders issued a warning that landed like a punch to the gut. The U.S. wasn't facing a housing slowdown, it was facing a full-blown affordability collapse. Suppliers struggled to keep inventory. Lumber yards reported empty shelves. Even major retailers like Home Depot and Lowe's started raising prices weekly to keep up with demand. Banks tightened lending standards, unsure whether unfinished projects would ever be completed. In the suburbs, what were once bustling neighborhoods became graveyards of paused ambition, silent proof that tariffs had consequences far beyond politics. The same policy meant to bring jobs home had done the opposite. Sawmills couldn't hire because they couldn't sell. Construction companies laid off thousands. The dream of home ownership, the heartbeat of America's middle class, was slipping into fantasy. Families that had spent years saving for a home now faced another reality: they'd never catch up. The American dream had been priced out of existence, not by foreign competition, but by domestic pride. And as frustration boiled across the country, one neighbor quietly watched and thrived. While the United States wrestled with crisis, Canada was quietly rewriting its future. What began as a defensive move had evolved into a national transformation. The country that once shipped raw logs across the border was now exporting engineered wood, cross-laminated timber, and advanced structural composites, products that fetched higher value and showcased world-class innovation. Carney's government doubled down on modernization. Federal and provincial grants poured into AI-powered sawmills, precision-cutting technologies, and green forestry programs designed to make every step of production carbon neutral. Lumber wasn't just a commodity anymore. It was a high-tech, sustainable export built on science and strategy. Major industry players like Canfor, West Fraser, and Resolute Forest Products began leading global conversations about carbon-negative construction and renewable building materials. Canada became one of the first nations to link forestry innovation with climate goals, a move that instantly appealed to Europe and Asia, where green building codes were rapidly tightening. In places like British Columbia, sawmills once threatened by closure came roaring back with automation. Smaller towns that had relied on a single buyer, the U.S., now shipped to multiple continents. Ports on the Pacific coast became launchpads for a diversified economy, but beyond the numbers was something deeper: confidence. Canadians no longer viewed themselves as secondary suppliers to the U.S. market. They had found their own rhythm, their own customers, and their own identity. What had started as a desperate pivot was now a statement of strength. Canada could compete and win on its own terms. And as the world began to recognize the maple leaf as a symbol of quality and reliability, Ottawa's patience had turned into profit. Canada wasn't surviving the trade war, it was redefining it. The great irony of Trump's lumber war was that the harder America tried to weaken Canada, the stronger Canada became. Every tariff, every insult, every attempt to cut ties only pushed Ottawa to innovate faster, expand further, and lead smarter. The plan that was supposed to cripple Canada's dependence had instead destroyed Washington's leverage. By 2025, the contrast between the two nations couldn't have been clearer. In Tokyo, Berlin, and Seoul, Canadian officials were signing multi-billion-dollar supply contracts, deals that once would have gone straight to the U.S., but the world had seen enough chaos in Washington to look elsewhere for consistency. Canada became the symbol of reliability in an age of volatility. International builders began calling Canadian lumber the gold standard for sustainability. Japan called it pink gold, strong, beautiful, and traceable from forest to frame. Meanwhile, the U.S. lumber sector was mired in finger-pointing. Unions blamed the government, companies blamed regulators, and consumers blamed everyone. The truth was simple. Protectionism hadn't protected America, it had isolated it. What started as a boast of independence had turned into a quiet confession of weakness, because when you cut off your allies, you don't grow stronger, you just stand alone. For Canada, this wasn't just an economic win, it was a psychological one. The country that had been treated like a junior partner had proven it could thrive without permission. Its success wasn't built on revenge, but on resilience. And so, while America's unfinished suburbs and empty job sites told one story of pride and fallout, Canada's bustling ports told another, a story of vision, patience, and power. The lesson was written in every shipment leaving Vancouver's coast: adaptation builds empires, arrogance destroys them. In the end, the lumber war was never just about trade, it was about pride, perception, and power. One man's declaration, "We don't need Canada's lumber," set off a chain reaction that exposed the fragility of America's economic ego. What was meant to prove dominance instead revealed dependence. What was sold as strength ended in scarcity. And what began as a loud victory speech closed in silence. As construction halted, prices soared, and trust vanished. Across the border, Canada didn't gloat. It didn't need to. Its success was quiet, strategic, and permanent. By embracing modernization and diversification, Ottawa turned a moment of humiliation into a masterclass in economic reinvention. From Asia to Europe, countries that once looked to Washington for stability were now calling on Canada. The same nation dismissed as just a supplier had become a global benchmark for sustainable industry. Meanwhile, America faced a reckoning. Empty neighborhoods, unfinished homes, and soaring mortgage rates told the story politicians refused to admit: protectionism had failed. By trying to wall itself off, the U.S. had locked itself in. For Canada, the transformation was complete. It was no longer the sidekick in North America's economy. It was the strategist, the innovator, the steady hand in a volatile world. And for the United States, the cost of pride was clear. Billions lost, industries weakened, and an ally turned leader. This wasn't just a lesson in economics, it was a warning written in timber and time. Because when power becomes arrogance and policy becomes ego, history always delivers the same result. Canada adapted, America resisted, and the world changed sides.